Wait for a few minutes so that other participants can join. I think we can begin. Thank you for joining. This is a week 3 problem solving session on the NPTEL certification course on environmental impact assessment, which is taught by Dr. Harshit Soshin Lakra, who's an assistant professor at the Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee. And so this is the Saturday session. We have another session which happens on Tuesday. So the Saturday session is taken by me. I'm Isha Rathod. I am a PMRF and doctoral student at the Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee. Whereas the Tuesday session is taken by Miss Monica S., who's another PMRF TA and a doctoral student at Department of Architecture and Regional Planning, IIT Kharagpur. Since it's just the two of us, we can keep it simple. You can unmute yourself for the session and ask your questions directly. And if you are uncomfortable with speaking, you can just post your questions in the chat box. This is for the larger audience, of course, but since it's just the two of us, you can just unmute yourself and ask your questions or answer the questions when I ask you. Okay. And then, so the sessions are the outline of this session is that we're going to look up at the highlights from each week. That is, we're going to look up at the key takeaways from each of the lecture units from week three's content. And then we are going to look up at some additional questions for practice along with their solutions. And we're also going to look up at the solutions for assignment 3 because the deadline of assignment 3 has passed. And then I'm going to reply to queries which I received in the discussion forum. So just a note, you can post your queries in the discussion forums as and when you find something you need clarification on while looking at the week's content or the lecture units. So you can just comment at that point and ask your query in the discussion forums. Me and Monica, we both go through the discussion forum and try to put queries in the week's content to discuss them. And then there's an additional content, which is a further extension of a topic which was discussed in this week's content. So this is the general outline of the session. And week 3, as you know, was focused on EIA procedure, where we talked about scoping, screening, and establishing baseline conditions. And so moving on to highlights from week 3. So we're going to now discuss each of the lecture units. So week 3 had 5 lecture units, and the first 2 lecture units talked about the sustainable development timeline. Lecture 11 talked about the World Sustainable Development Timeline from 1970 to 1999, and it talked about it from an environmental perspective in terms of initiatives and uh, events, in terms of law, policy, guidelines which came up, and organization or institutions which were developed at different levels. So I have tried to put them together in the form of a timeline the in terms of the events which are shown on the left, in terms of the year which is shown on the left, as well as the events. And then I've tried to put it in uh, the type of event, whether it's an event or it's a policy, or was it a trend at that time, or was it a disaster. So in terms of a type category, and then I've classified them into categories based on what was their focus category. It could be water, environment, biodiversity, food security, technology, uh, land, oil, water, those sort of category classifications. So we're going to look up at all of these events, and I'm just going to go through my notes and read through them and discuss on what these events were around. So, and as we'll go along, so lecture 11 and lecture 12 both have this format where I have classified them into the type and category of the event or the initiative which was taken. So in 1973, we had the United Nations Conference on Law of the Sea, which happened in New York. And the objective of this was to talk about peaceful use of seabed and ocean floor. And the mandate of the conference was to adopt a convention dealing with all matters relating to the law of the sea, and it basically had three topics. The first one was the international regime of the seabed and ocean floor beyond national jurisdiction. So they wanted to have an international discussion around seabed and ocean floors, and not just being limited to national guidelines. They wanted to have an international and cross-boundary context. And then the second topic was to talk about territorial sea, the exclusive economic zone, high seas, coastal lines, and the transmissions from the high seas. And the third topic was the preservation of the marine environment. So all of these three topics, they were to deal with regional arrangements as well as responsibility and liability of the damage resulting from the use of marine environment in terms of settlements of disputes, in terms of peaceful use of ocean space, and maintaining peace and security via the ocean. So the law of the sea is basically about the everything relating to sea, and in the terms of an international dialogue. And so this was in the category of water or sea. And this was an event because this was a conference where a lot of countries came together and talked about these three topics. And then moving on, in 1973, we also had the European Environmental Action Plan. Please mute yourself. Okay. So in 1973, we also had the European Environmental Action Plan, so the EAP. So it was a significant initiative taken by the European Economic Community, or the EEC, to address the environmental concerns which were happening in Europe. And it was the first comprehensive policy on environmental protection and conservation, which was adopted by the EEC, or the European Economic Community. Okay, and this was launched in response to the growing concern over pollution and environmental degradation, which was caused by the oil crisis of 1973, which is something we have not covered in the lecture modules. And the program aimed to establish the framework for environmental protection and conservation across Europe, and to harmonize national environmental policies. And it looked up at six key areas of actions, and they were air pollution, water pollution, waste management, noise pollution, conservation of nature and wildlife, and the environmental impact assessment of development projects. So this was particularly in terms of Europe. And this was an action plan, and this covered the larger environment in terms of air, water, noise, wildlife, biodiversity, and all of those things. So it comes under the category of environment. And then moving on, in 1973, United States also enacted the Endangered Species Act. So this is an act which later became a law as well. And this basically aims at protecting and recovering endangered and threatened species of plant and animals and the ecosystems upon which they depend. So this was basically to preserve and conserve, protect and recover the endangered and threatened species at that time. And this was due to a growing concern because of a rapid decline in the numbers of many species, because of habitat loss, pollution, overhunting, and other human activities. So this law provided protection to these species, and they did this by listing the different species in different categories, and then further putting designating critical habitats where these species will not be harmed and protected, and the development and implementation of recovery plans on how to reintroduce them in wild and to protect them in conservation parks. And so they also put species into different categories and then have further listing of things where they say that this category is to be protected at a particular severity and magnitude. And then, yes. And then we have something which happened in India, which was the Chipko movement. So this originated in Uttarakhand, which was Uttaranchal at that point, and this was a response. This was a response to the wide widespread deforestation in the area. So uh, a lot of villagers and women come together and hug the tree. So chipko in Hindi actually means to hug or to embrace. So that's where the movement's name come from. So the protesters were basically hugging the trees in order to prevent the agencies from cutting the trees. And yeah, so women played a prominent role in this movement because they were affected by the loss of forest and fuel for the also cutting of trees leads to soil erosion and the displacement of soil where the layers become loose. So this is also cause of landfills and other things which were happening at that point in the Indian state. And this was also one of the first instances in India of environmental activism, where the community came together and protected the environment. So this was a event, and it was basically towards protecting the trees. So I put it in the biodiversity category. And then Chipko movement also played a significant role in shaping the forest policy of India. So moving on to the 1974, we had the United Nations Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora. So this was an international trade. Inter, uh, so this was a global treaty which was adopted in 1974, and the objective was to regulate the international trade of in wild animals and plants to ensure that this does not threaten their survival. Please mute yourself. Okay, right. And yeah, so the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Flora and Fauna, it is also abbreviated as CITES, CITES, which is Convention on International Trades in Endangered Species, the initials of these words. And this ensures that the international trade in wild animals and plants is sustainable, legal, and is traceable, and it operates through a system of permits and regulates the import, export, and re-export of listed species. And so sites cover approximately 5,800 species of animals and 30,000 species of plants. And this is administered by the United Nations Environment Program, which is the UNEP. And this is enforced through national laws and regulations. And party to these treaties are required to submit reports on the implementation of sites every 2 or 3 years to UNEP. And this is basically to regulate the trade between certain wild animals and plants. And then moving on, 1974 also was the year in which the first World Population Conference took place in Bucharest, and 135 countries participated in it. So this conference was organized by the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA, and it marked the first time that population issues were discussed on a global level. And the primary goal was to examine the relationship between the population growth, development, social welfare, and the ways to promote sustainable development. And so this was the first time when population issues and their impacts were discussed at a global level. And at the same time, we also had the World Food Conference, which was held in Rome. This was again uh, based on the response to concerns about food security and rising food prices in the event of the in the basically in the aftermath of the 1973 oil crisis which happened. And they brought together 140 countries, and they primarily discussed the global food crisis and ways to ensure that food security is available for all people, especially those living in developing countries. And one of the key outcomes of this conference was the adoption of the Universal Declaration on Eradication of Hunger and Malnutrition, which declared that every man, woman, and child has the inalienable right to be free from hunger and malnutrition. And this called for an increased investment in agriculture and rural development and the promotion of sustainable farming practices, and provision of emergency food stock and aid for those in need. So this was also one of the concerns which were happening in 1974. And then 1975, we had a public awareness of global environmental threats, and it catalyzed effective policy responses. So if you remember the first few lectures from week one, we talked about how the modern environmental movement moved from conservation, preservation, and is now at risk mitigation, basically. So we are currently at the conservation and preservation state. So you can see that all of these laws and these things are towards conservation and preservation of the environment. And okay, so in 1975, we also looked up at we also had the enforcement of the sites, basically. So this was adopted at regional levels by different countries. And this again talked about the regulation of trade between wild animals and plants. And in 1976, we had the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements, which happened in Vancouver, Canada. And this is also known as Habitat 1. And this was organized by United Nations in response to rapid growth of urbanization and the need to address social and environmental impacts of urbanization on a large scale, on a global scale. And the primary goal of this conference was to develop a global strategy for human settlements such that they promote sustainable urban development and improve the quality of life for people living in cities and towns. So just to highlight that the word sustainable development was not a term which was used at that point of time. So they described it in certain different words, but the idea was the sustainable development of towns and cities. And so this conference also led to the establishment of United Nations Human Settlement Program, the UN Habitat, which serves as the focal point for urbanization and human settlement issues within the UN system. And it also promotes the urban development and improve the living conditions of people in cities and towns through different initiatives and programs. You can look it up online if you're interested in it. And then in the year 1977, we had the Green Belt movement, which happened in Kenya. So the Green Belt movement was founded by Professor Wangari Maathai, who also later received the Nobel Peace Prize, and she was the first African woman and an environmentalist who received this prize in 2004. So it was founded by Professor Wangari Maathai, and this movement was a response to the rapid deforestation and the environmental degradation, which was taking place in Kenya due to population growth, urbanization, and unsustainable uh, land management and the use of natural resources. And so the Green Belt movement basically focused on mobilizing women in the rural communities to plant trees and to engage in sustainable land use practices. Uh, they also played a role in environmental conservation and sought to empower the women through training, resources, and support to take action on their own communities. And so the early efforts of this movement were in terms of tree planting initiatives, which helped to improve the soil fertility, combat erosion, and provide a source of fuel timber for the local communities. But as the movement grew, they also focused on a range of environmental and social justice issues, including advocacy for the democratic government, gender equality, and human rights. So the Green Belt movement started as something for the environment, and it later went into the environment economic discipline, where they talked about social justice along with environment and gender equality along with environment. Uh, yeah, so this was one of critical movements which happened. And then in 1977, we also had the United Nations Conference on Desertification, which happened in Nairobi. And so this was in response to the growing concern over the spread of desertification and land degradation in the semi-arid regions of the world, particularly in Africa. And they came together to develop a global strategy for combating desertification and using sustainable land use practices. And the conference resulted in the adoption of the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD, which is again an international treaty, which happened particularly later, which was in 1994. So this was the groundwork for the UNCCD, which was the treaty that aimed to address the root causes of desertification, land degradation, and drought, and emphasize the importance of community participation and local knowledge in combating desertification. And then we also had the United Nations Water Conference, which was held in Mar del Plata, which is the uh, so this was over water scarcity, water pollution, and the lack of clean water and sanitation in many parts of the world. So the goal of this conference was to develop a global strategy for addressing the water-related issues and promoting sustainable water management practices across the world. And this conference provided a framework for international cooperation in addressing water-related issues and promoting sustainable water management practices. And it also talked about integrated water resource management, need for effective policies and governance structures, and the importance of community participation and the awareness in achieving sustainable water management through international participations. And then in 1978, we had the Amoco Cadiz oil spill of the coast of Brittany, France. So this was one of the largest oil spills in the history. And we had a oil tanker, which was Amoco Cadiz, which ran off ground in the coast of Brittany, which is in France. And the tanker was carrying over 1.6 million barrels of crude oil, and it spilled approximately 2.2 lakh tons of oil into the sea, polluting over 300 kilometers of the coastline. And this oil spill had devastating consequences on the local environment in terms of killing the wildlife and damaging the fishing industry for a few years. And it also impacted the public opinion and led to increased awareness towards moving away from fossil fuels and the risk of transporting fossil fuels. And it also led to the development of stronger regulations to prevent environmental hazards like this from happening in the future. So the French government passed a series of laws to strengthen the shipping and improve emergency response capabilities in case of future oil spill events. And they also It also led to the larger dialogue on the adaptation of on the adaptation and need for policies and frameworks for emergency events like these, and regulating these phenomena from happening, these events from happening. And in 1978, we also had the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, which is the OECD, which relaunched its research on environment and economic linkages. So the OECD has been conducting research on the linkage between environment and economy. So it basically relaunched its research program, recognizing the growing importance of environmental issues and their potential impact on the economic growth and development. So the OECD's work on environment and economic linkage, it focuses on understanding the interactions between the economic activities and the natural environment, and it centers around developing policies and strategies to promote sustainable development. And their research topics include economics of biodiversity, the valuation of ecosystem services, and the environmental impacts of different economic sectors. And so this was again a trend in the environmental aspect, where we moved towards an environment economy discipline, where we talk about the economic effects of the environment uh, and the other things which affect the economy aspect of the ecosystem. And then we move on to year 1979. So we had the Convention on Long Range Transboundary Air Pollution, uh, and this was adopted. So this is basically a legally binding treaty which aimed at addressing the issue of air pollution across national borders. So it was adopted in Geneva, Switzerland, and it came into force in 1983. And this convention was designed to protect human health and environment from the adverse effects of air pollution, including acidification, eutrophication, ground level ozone. And it establishes framework for international cooperation on measures to reduce air pollutants and emissions and to promote sustainable development. And so, under this convention, participating countries are required to develop and implement national and regional strategies to reduce emissions of the air pollutants, and as well as to cooperate with other countries in the development of international air pollution control programs. So, this was basically targeted towards air pollution control and mitigation. And then in 1979, we also had a publication by Robert Stein, which is basically a book which is called Banking on the Biosphere. So in this book, he explores the potential for using financial mechanisms to promote conservation and sustainable use of natural resources. And this book also talks about how financial markets can be used to incentivize business and individuals to invest in sustainable development and protect the world's natural ecosystems. So he explores financial strategies like green bond, green bonds, ecosystem service markets, conservation finance, and discusses how they can be used to incentivize businesses to adopt sustainable practices. So, and this book is considered a pioneering work in the field of conservation finance. So you can see that we have moved towards a discipline of talking about environment and finance together, which is looking at the economic aspect of the environment to understand the value that the environment is having. And then, so this was a publication which talked about environment economy. And then in 1979, we also had the 3 Mile Island, which was a nuclear accident which occurred in Pennsylvania, USA. And so this basically occurred at the 3 Mile Island nuclear generating station. And this was caused by a cooling system malfunction in one of the plant's reactors, which led to the partial meltdown of the reactor core. And this caused a small amount of radioactive gas to be released in the environment. Although there were no immediate fatalities or deaths from this event, this incident raised concerns about the safety of nuclear power plants. and it led to a significant cleanup effort by the government and the review of nuclear safety regulations. And it also had a profound impact on public opinion towards the use of nuclear energy and nuclear power plants in the US. And it also contributed to the decline in the number of new nuclear power plants in the USA because of the declining public opinion. So this was a disaster which was not severe, but was still a major impacting point for the US government. And then in 1979, we also had the World Climate Conference, which concluded that the greenhouse effect from increased buildup of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere demands urgent international action. So, the World Climate Conference happened in Geneva, Switzerland, and this conference identified a number of potential risks associated with climate change, including the increased greenhouse effect. And this conference also emphasized the need for first of all, it identified that man-made activities were causing the greenhouse effect, and we need to take up a significant international action. So it called for international cooperation to address the issue of reducing the greenhouse gas emissions. So this was one, and uh, accepting that man-made action is causing problems to the environment, and then calling on international collaboration to counter the effect of man-made uh, carbon dioxide buildup, which is causing the greenhouse gas effect. And then moving on to year 1980. So in year 1980, we had the World Conservation Strategy, which was a report prepared by the International Union for Conservation of Nature, which is the IUCN. And this they had a specific section which talked about sustainable development. So this was a publication on environment where the term sustainable development was first introduced. And so this report basically aims to promote a new approach to conservation, which emphasize the need for to integrate conservation and development objectives in a sustainable manner. And the key section, which is towards sustainable development, outlines the principles for achieving sustainable development, and so in this section they talk about meeting the basic needs of people presently without compromising the needs of the future, and ensuring that natural resources are used in a sustainable manner so that they are available for the future generations to be used. And they also highlighted that the more integrated and coordinated approach or integration in development should be undertaken by the different sectors of the society. That is, the government, the civil society, the private sector, and the public sector should come together and talk about the strategies and development to be overseen in the future. So this report had a significant impact on the global conservation and development agenda, and this was especially helpful in bringing the concept of sustainable development for environmental management and development to the public opinion. And it also influenced the development of numerous international agreements, including the Rio Declaration and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, sorry. And the report remains and the report remains an important reference point still to promote sustainable development and conservation. So this was one of the key reports which talked about sustainable development and what the term sustainable development in use. And yeah. And then 1980 also had the Global 2000 report to the president, which was prepared by the Council on Environment Quality, CEQ, and the United States Department of State. So this report was basically presented to the president, and it was a comprehensive analysis of the global environment and the development trends and their potential impacts on the US, specifically to US. And the report predicted if the current trends continue, the world would face severe environmental and social challenges, including population growth, resource depletion, climate change. And they highlighted that urgent actions need to be taken to address these issues, including adoption of policies which talk about sustainable development and protecting the environment. So this was particularly to the US. So one thing I would like to highlight here is that the authorities which are responsible for the organization or authorities which are responsible for the event, that is for publication of reports or for a conference being held, are important. And secondly, the year or the date of the event is important, something to look for in the questions for the examination. So two things, the date and authorities, and of course the event are important from an examination point of perspective. Okay. And then moving on to the year 1981, which had the so we had another report, which is the so this is supposed to be a report, sorry. And so this is basically a global strategy for health for all by the year 2000. And this was by the World Health Assembly of the WHO, World Health Organization. So this report basically talks about promoting a comprehensive approach to improving the global health with a focus on achieving health for all by the year 2000. And it identified a number of key principles for achieving this report, including universal need for universal access to basic health systems or services, the importance of addressing social and economic determinants of health, and the need for the intersectoral cooperation to promote health to all sectors of the society. And this report was significant for the global health policy because it helped shift the focus of health systems from a narrow disease specific approach to a more comprehensive health for all approach, which talked about the importance of prevention, health promotion, and social and economic development. So this shifted the perspective from a disease based health to preventional health. And then we have the United Nations. In 1982, we had the United Nations Convention on Law of Sea. So this is known as UNCLOS, so United Nations Convention on Law of Sea, UNCLOS. So this is an international treaty which was adopted in 1982, and this is often referred to as Constitution for the Ocean. And this is a comprehensive framework for the so this is a comprehensive framework for the use of oceans, including and for establishing the rules for marine scientific research, environmental protection, and the settlement of disputes related to the ocean and sea use. So this was again one of the things which was influenced by the 1973 uh, Conference on Law of Sea. And then in 1983, we had the uh, National Conservation Strategy from Australia. So the National Conservation Strategy is a policy document which was released by the Australian government, and they aim to promote and conserve Australia's natural resources. So they had 6 key areas of focus, which was biodiversity conservation, land conservation and management, coastal and marine conservation, resource conservation and management, urban environment, and the environmental education and awareness. So this was an important step in Australia's environmental policy because it helped to establish a framework for conservation and sustainable use of the country's natural resources. And it also helps to foster greater cooperation between government, industry, and community groups in addressing the environmental issues. So this was an uh, important event in the Australian environmental timeline. And then in 1983, we also had the World Commission on Environment and Development. So the WCED is the World Commission on Environment and Development. So this was established by the United Nations in the in 1983, of course. And the goal was to promote sustainable development and address environmental issues on a global scale. So WCED also later produced this landmark report, which is known as the Brundtland report, or our common future report, which defines sustainable development as meeting the needs of future without compromising the needs of meeting the needs of the present without compromising the needs of the future. So they are responsible for putting forward the reports which talk about sustainable development. They are a commission basically. So this should be an organization. And then in 1984, we had the Bhopal gas tragedy, which happened in Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh, in India. And so this was caused by a gas leak from the Union Carbide India Limited UCIL pesticide plant. So it released a highly toxic cloud of methyl isocyanate gas into the air, and which is one of the worst industrial disasters. And the gas leak killed an estimated 4,000 people immediately, and the total death toll has been estimated to be as high as 15,000 people in 1984. Of course, this is a large number. And so hundreds of thousands of people were also injured or suffered long-term health effects as a result of exposure to this gas. And this incident raised concern about the safety of chemical plants and the need for stricter regulations for the chemical industry. And Union Carbide, which was the parent company of UCIL, was heavily criticized for handling the disaster and its response to the victim. And the company paid a settlement of $470 million to the Indian government in 1989 to basically to the victims' families for the by taking the guilty verdict. And then, so this was one of the chemical disasters which happened in India. And in 1984, we had drought-induced starvation in Ethiopia. So Ethiopia experienced a severe drought that led to widespread famine and starvation. And this event brought about attention to the issue of global hunger and the need for greater investment in agricultural development and food security. And it also highlighted the need for better coordination and cooperation among governments, relief organizations, and private sector in responding to humanitarian crisis. So this was basically an event which triggered a dialogue about food security and humanitarian access. So this is an event which is targeted towards land, water, food security, and human rights. So they are not shown here probably. And yeah. And then 1984, we also had the concept of environment and economics relationship, which was discussed at the International Conference on Environment and Economics. And one key outcome from this conference was the recognition that environment and economy are intimately linked, and that a sustainable future requires a more integrated approach to economic development and environmental protection. So we can say that during the 1980s, 1970s to 80s, we have a lot of discussion around the environment economic concept. And then in 1985, the Antarctic hole was discovered, and this was observed over Antarctica. That the ozone layer was depleted over Antarctica, which was causing an increase in the harmful ultraviolet radiations in reaching the Earth's surface. And this was a significant environmental milestone as it highlighted the destructive nature of human activities in the Earth's atmosphere. And the main cause of ozone hole was, of course, the release of chlorofluorocarbons and other ozone depleting substances in the atmosphere, which break down the ozone molecules. And this discovery of ozone hole led to the adoption of the Montreal Protocol in 1987, and which was an international agreement which pushed towards phasing out the production of chlorofluorocarbons and the consumption of ozone depleting substances. So this was again one of the disasters, a man-made disaster at that. And then we also had the the World Meteorological Society, the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, and the International Council of Scientific Union meet in Vienna. So they basically met to discuss the stratospheric ozone depletion, and they talked about putting forward scientific evidence on its potential impacts on human health and environment. And they resulted in the establishment of a scientific assessment panel, which was a group of international experts who were charged with periodically reviewing and assessing the state of scientific knowledge on ozone depletion and its impact. And this panel was instrumental in informing the policy decisions related to the protection of ozone layer, including the negotiation and implementation of the Montreal Protocol later in 1987. And then we also had Responsible Care, which was an initiative of the Canadian Chemical Producers Association. So this was a voluntary organization launched by the Canadian Chemical Producers Association, the CCPA. And they aimed to improve the safety, health, and environmental performance of the chemical industry, and they called on chemical companies to voluntarily commit to a set of guiding principles and performance standards to minimize the impact of their operations and on the environment and the surrounding environment. So this is like a public voluntary approach or a business voluntary group. And then in 1986, we had the Conference on Environment and Development, IUC, in Ottawa. So this conference was organized and was focused on several key themes, which include the need for integrated approach for environmental and economic planning, the importance of biodiversity conservation, the role of indigenous people in environmental management, and the need for international cooperation on environmental issues. And 1986 was also the year in which we looked up at the catastrophic nuclear disaster um, accident, which is the Chernobyl disaster, which happened in the Ukrainian SSR, Soviet Union. So the number 4 reactor in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, during a safety test, witnessed an unexpected power surge, which caused the reactor to explode, and which led to the release of a massive amount of radioactive material into the environment. And this explosion and subsequent fire killed 2 workers at the plant immediately, and many more were to follow in the following weeks and months due to acute radiation sickness. And this disaster caused significant environmental and health consequences, with long-term effects still being felt in that region today and by the people who were exposed to these radiations at that point of time. Also, there's an exclusion zone around the plant to prevent human habitation and the in the areas because the area is highly contaminated with radioactive material now. So this again led to the dialogue of nuclear power plant and nuclear energy. Uh, it led to the negative side effect of nuclear energy being discussed in the public opinion. And then, of course, in 1987, we have the Our Common Future, or the Birkeland Report, which was put forth by the World Commission on Environment and Development, the WCED. And this they define sustainable development as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the need of the future, and highlighted the interdependence of different uh, economic, society, and environment together as the 3 pillars for sustainable development. And the term sustainable development became popular through this report. And then in 1987, we had the Montreal Protocol. So this protocol aimed at protecting the Earth's ozone layer by phasing out the production and consumption of chlorofluorocarbons and substances and other ozone depleting substances, ODS, ozone depleting surfaces, substances. And then in 1987, we also had the world population reaching 5 billion, which was a trend. And also the guidelines for environment and development in bilateral aid were developed by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. And so these guidelines, they talk about integrating environmental consideration into development cooperation and foreign aid programs. And so they talk about environmental issues like climate change, biodiversity conservation, natural resource management, pollution prevention, sustainable agriculture, forestry, and a lot of other things. And so they basically are a practical guidance on how to assess environmental impacts of aid projects and how to identify and manage risks and mitigate them in their design, implementation, monitoring phases. And in 1988, we had the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is a scientific body which was established by the UNEP and the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, to look at the effects, to assess the science impact and policy responses to climate change. And so the IPCC is responsible for putting forward comprehensive reports, specifically for policymakers to address climate change. And they provide overview of the current state of knowledge on climate change, its causes, impacts, and future projections. And they also assess potential risks and opportunities associated with the different mitigation and adaptation strategies relating to climate change, of course. And then in 1988, we looked up at the use of technology, which was satellite imagery, to document the effect of fires in the Amazon forest. And so this helped us in understanding the extent and impact of the fires, which were and their significant concern for environmentalist and indigenous groups. So these images showed widespread destruction of forest cover and habitat, and led to a wider discussion by the public because of the visual evidence being presented. And yeah. And then we also had the in 19 attention on destruction of the world's largest remaining tropical forest by Chico Mendes, who was an environmentalist, and he drew attention towards the rapid destruction of the largest remaining tropical forest, which is the Amazon. And he talked about promoting sustainable practices and protection of rights of forest dwellers, and raised awareness on the impact of deforestation on the Amazon forest, and said that it is a crucial carbon sink for the Earth's climate, and it should not be destructed. So he was an environmentalist. And then in 1989, we had the establishment of the Stockholm Environment Institute, which was established as an independent international research organization. And they specialized in sustainable development and environmental issues. And they were formed by the Swedish government to look up at research, policy analysis, and capacity building activities on a range of topics, specifically from for the Swedish people and the country, as well as uh, for the Earth. And they look up at topics including climate change, energy, water resources, biodiversity, sustainable urbanization, and yeah, to provide knowledge and methods to have better decision making potential. And then in 1989, we again had an oil spill by the Exxon Valdez uh, oil tanker, which dumped 11 million gallons of oil into the Prince William Sound, Alaska. And the spill released, this was again one of the largest oil spills, and it affected marine animals, damaged coastal habitat, disrupted the fishing and ecotourism industries. And this was also a significant impact because it led to the passage of the Oil Pollution Act in 1990, which set higher standards for oil tankers and oil spill response plans. So this was an incident which triggered an act. And then in 1989, we also had a publication called The Blueprint for Green Economy by Edward Barbier, Anil Markandeya, and David Pierce, which presented the central role of environment in economy and public policy decision. So this book talked about This book talked about the environmental protection and economic development, and said that they are not mutually exclusive, but they are integrated together, and it's necessary to look at both of them together for sustainable development. And then in 1990, we had the International Institute for Sustainable Development. So this was a non-profit organization which aimed to promote sustainable development across the world. And it was established by the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, UNCED, also known as the Earth Summit, which held in Rio, Brazil. It was established following that event, and it conducts research analysis, provides information services to help policymakers and stakeholders in public and private sectors to make informed decisions about sustainable development. And then the Earth Negotiation Bulletin is again, I'm sorry, this is a publication which talks about the environment in general. So this is a publication that covers analysis on coverage on international negotiations on environment, and it's an important source for information for policymakers, activists, and media. So they basically look up at all the negotiations and policies on the environment and cover their impact. And then in 1990, we also had the United Nations World Summit for Children, which was held in New York, and it discussed a wide range of issues related to children health and welfare. And so it basically said that environmental issues such as pollution, deforestation, and loss of biodiversity are connected to the future generations' uh, health and well-being, which is access to healthcare, nutrition, education, clean water. All of these are related to the children of today and the future. And so one of the key outcomes of this summit was the World Declaration on the Survival, Protection, and Development of Children. And it recognized that well-being of children was closely linked to the state of environment, and environmental degradation threatened the survival and development of children. So, yes. And then we also had the establishment of Regional Environmental Center for Central and Eastern Europe to address environmental challenges across the region. So with the this was because the CCE, which is the Central Eastern Europe, was facing has recently witnessed the collapse of communism, and they were facing environmental challenge due to years of neglect and underinvestment in environmental protection. And so the RAC was created as a non-profit, non-advocacy organization with the mission of promoting cooperation and dialogue between governments, NGOs, and businesses and other stakeholders to address environmental issues in the Central and Eastern European region. And then in 1991, we had the cod fishery in the Canadian East Coast collapsing, and this was because cod population was a food source and an income generating venue for the region. And because of overfishing and mismanagement of fishery, it led to this rapid decline in pollution, which caused the Canadian government to ban uh, cod fishing in the region, which is still active today. And then we also witnessed this man-made disaster, which was that the hundreds of oil fires were burning out of control in Kuwait in the wake of Gulf War. So this was basically when the Gulf War ended in 1991. The Iraqi forces, they set more than 700 oil wells in Kuwait on fire because they were fleeing the country. And this was one of the largest man-made disasters in history. And the fires burned for more than months. They burned for more than several months and released a vast amount of smoke and toxic pollutants in the air, causing respiratory problems for the population and the local ecosystem. And they were also responsible for greenhouse gas emissions and contributing to the global climate change. This was a man-made disaster again. And then in 1991, we had Caring for Earth, a strategy for sustainable living. strategy for sustainable living. So this was a report presented by the IUCN and UNEP and the WWF, and they published a set of 132 action principles for to increase the human well-being while halting the destruction of the Earth's capacity to support life. And they emphasized the importance of balancing economic development with environmental conservation, and urged individuals, organizations, and governments to work together for sustainable development. And it also led to the formation of the Global Environment Facility to promote to provide funding and grants for projects which benefit the global environment and promote sustainable livelihood in local communities. We also had the UNECE, or the ESPO Convention on EIA 1991, which was again a transboundary context and the first EIA-specific international treaty. And so this treaty aimed to enhance the effectiveness of EIA by requiring requiring that countries notify and consult with one another about proposed projects that might have significant environmental impact across borders. So yes. And then we had one publication, which was the Changing Course by the Business Council for Sustainable Development. And they established business interests in promoting sustainable development practices. So again, the concept of environment and economy being linked together in this publication. And in 1992, we had the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, Rio de Janeiro. And this was also known as the Earth Summit. And they had a few key developments which happened in the Earth Summit. So Agenda 21, which is a comprehensive plan of action for sustainable development, was formed. Then there was the creation of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. And also the creation of Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD. And then we also had three key principles for sustainable development, which were identified: that the polluter pay principle, which is that the polluting country should pay the other countries monetary sum for causing pollution; the precautionary principle; and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. So these are a few things which were discussed in the Earth Summit, or the Rio de Janeiro Conference on Environment and Development. And then in 1993, we had this establishment of the United Nations Commission on Sustainable Development, which oversees the implementation of Agenda 21. And then we also had the World Conference on Human Rights in Vienna. So this conference reviewed and strengthened the implementation of international human rights and standards, and identified new strategies for promoting and protecting human rights. And they recognize that the link between human rights and environment is critical, stating that human rights and fundamental freedoms are the birthright of all human beings and are essential for the full development of the human personality, and to enable individuals to live in dignity and freedom and to participate effectively in society. So they confirmed the international commitments to all human rights, and they appointed the first UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And they also received a large funding under the Global Environment Facility. And then this was another development which happened in 1994, which was that the North American Free Trade Agreement was put into force. So the National American Free Trade Agreement created a free trade zone between Canada, US, and Mexico, removing tariffs and other barriers to trade between the three countries, which is basically the North America. And it had a significant impact on trade, investment, and employment in the region, but it was also controversial because it led to job losses and environmental damage and other negative effects. So in order to counter that, they also had the North American Agreement on Environmental Cooperation, which was signed as a side agreement to this free trade agreement between the governments. And this aimed to address environmental issues related to economic integration between the three countries and to promote cooperation for environmental protection and sustainable development. So this is basically for the North America region. And then in 1994, we also had the International Conference on Population and Development in Cairo. And this conference resulted in the adoption of the Program of Action, which recognized the reproductive health and gender equality as critical components of sustainable development, and recognized the need to provide universal access to education, healthcare, and family planning services. So this could be environment, human rights, health as well. And then we also had the United Nations Convention on Desertification. So this was basically to combat desertification and mitigate the effects of drought in the world regions through cooperation and partnerships, through international cooperation and partnerships, and recognize the participation of local communities and indigenous people in decision-making process. And in 1994, we also had the United States Agency for International Development, redefining foreign assistance programs in terms of sustainable development. So they basically, so this new policy emphasized the need for integrated approaches to development that took into account the interdependence of economic and social and environmental factors, and the involvement of all stakeholders in the development process, including the government, civil society, private sectors, and public sectors, to meet the needs of the needs and aspirations for all members of society. And then in 1995, we had the establishment of World Trade Organization to regulate international trade and promote free trade by setting rules and resolving disputes between member countries. We also had the World Summit for Social Development in Copenhagen, whose agenda was promoting social development and reducing poverty. And then the international community commitment to address the problem of poverty. And yeah, so this was from this as well. These should be together. So they are basically talking about human rights, both of these events. And then in 1995, we also had the Congregation of Party COP1 under the UNFCCC signatories, where they gathered in Berlin to talk about the implementation of the convention and developing strategies for mitigating and adapting to climate change. Yes, and then we also had the fourth conference on women, which was held in Beijing to acknowledge the issue of women's rights and status. And this focused on issues relating to gender equality, women's rights, and empowerment of women from an environmental introduction perspective. And then in 1997, we had the Voluntary International Standard for Corporate Environmental Management System, which is the ISO 14001, which was formally adopted. So this is a voluntary standard to help organization identify and control the environmental impact and improve the environmental performance. So they establish environmental policies, set environmental objectives and targets, and implement programs which meet the objectives, which meet these objectives and targets, and procedures for monitoring and measuring the progress. And then we also had the United Nations Conference on Human Settlement in Istanbul, which is known as Habitat 2, which was held. So this was held, and they talked about issues related to urbanization, housing, sustainable development, and yeah. And then we also had the Asia Pacific Economic Cooperation meeting on sustainable development, which was held in Manila. And they also talked about sustainable cities, cleaner production technologies, sustainability of the marine ecosystem, and so forth. And then in 1997, we had a critical event, which was the Kyoto Protocol, which was discussed in the Congregation of Parties 3, which happened in Kyoto, Japan. And this was the first legally binding climate treaty, which required developed countries to reduce their emissions by an average of 5% below the 1990 level. So they were supposed to reduce their emissions for the year 2012 uh, to 5 by 5% below the 1990 level, and to establish a system to monitor countries' progress. But no such compulsion was put on developing countries. They also had uh, a carbon market where countries could cap and trade uh, uh, units to encourage sustainable development. So, for example, if a country produces more carbon emissions and another country does not produce enough carbon emissions, so they can trade their carbon emissions to the less carbon emission producing company for a monetary value. And then in 1998, we had the UNECE Aarhus Convention, and this convention had three pillars. First was the right of access to environmental information, which held by public authorities. The second was public participation in decision-making process, which affects the environment. And the third was environmental justice matters. And okay, so this was week one. So I've discussed a lot on the timeline, so I will go a little bit faster on lecture 12 timeline, which talked about the timeline from 2000 to 2021 from an environmental perspectives, initiatives, and events which came into play at different levels. So we had the World Trade Organization in 2001, which was the Doha Ministerial Declaration. So they had a roundtable negotiation which addressed the concerns of developing countries in the global trading system. And they discussed the relationship between trade and environment and the need to reconcile these two areas together in a mutually supportive manner. And then the World Summit on Sustainable Development, which happened in Johannesburg. So this was known as Rio 10, and this was a follow-up Earth Summit to the one which held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992. And they reviewed progress which was made in implementing the Sustainable Development Goals to discuss the new challenges and priorities based on the implementation process the countries have faced so far. And then the United Nations declares the Decade of Education for Sustainable Development in 2003. So this was a global initiative, and they aimed to integrate principal values and practices of sustainable development in all aspects of learning and education, and particularly in areas of climate change, biodiversity, poverty reduction, and social justice. And then in 2004, Wangri Maathai was the first environmentalist to win the Nobel Peace Prize for promoting sustainable development, democracy, and peace through the Green Belt movement, which happened in Kenya. And we also had the Millennial Ecosystem Assessment, which was in 2005, which was a 4-year study which assessed the consequences of ecosystem change on human well-being. And the study was conducted by over 1,300 scientists from 95 countries and was completed in 2005. And the study analyzed the state of world ecosystem and their impact on human well-being, and the ways in which ecosystem benefits people, and the drivers of ecosystem change, and provided recommendations for sustainable ecosystem management. And this was a significant contribution in understanding the links between the ecosystem and human well-being. And it continues to be a valuable source for policymakers and researchers. And then we had, in 2005, we had another disaster, uh, which was a natural disaster, the Hurricane Katrina, which was observed in Louisiana, USA. And this caused significant damage to the Gulf Coast and large number of deaths and monetary value in damages and in the US history. And then we had the Red Plus in 2005, which is reducing emissions for deforestation and forest degradation. So that is Red, and Red Plus is reducing emissions for deforestation and forest degradation, plus the sustainable management of forests and the enhancement of forest carbon stocks. And so these are international initiatives which aim at reducing greenhouse gas emissions by protecting forests. And by protecting forests and promoting sustainable forestry practices. And they provide financial incentives to countries that successfully reduce their rate of deforestation and forest degradations. And then we had the UN Climate Change Conference in Bali, and in 2007, and in 2008 we had the World Food Crisis, where the food prices increased drastically between 2007 and 2008, and a few of these other things which happened in 2008. Then we also had the World Glacier Monitoring Service report, which reported that the multi-layered sea ice is disappearing from the Arctic Ocean, and the world glaciers are melting at an unprecedented rate. So this was a large concern because of global warming happening. And then we also had another disaster, which was the Australian drought, which triggered the wildfires. And we also had the G20 agreement on phasing out fossil fuel subsidies. And another trend which we observed in 2009 was that the internet role in campaign grew. So you can now sign petitions online, and a lot of these things were happening at that point of time as well. And then we had COP15. We had another disaster, which was Typhoon Kitasna in the Philippines, and another summit on climate change in 2009. And then in 2010, we had COP15 in Cancun, Mexico, and the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. So the Nagoya Protocol on Benefit Sharing is on access to genetic resources, the fair and equitable sharing of benefits. So this arised from the utilization on the Convention on Biological Diversity, and it's a supplementary agreement to the CBD, which we discussed in CBD in. Yes, and so it basically talks about fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of genetic resources, contributing to conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. And it sets obligations for its contracting parties to take measure in order to access genetic resources, benefit sharing, and compliance. And then we had the in 2011 we had the Japan earthquake, which had a magnitude of 9 on the Richter scale, and the world population reached 7 billion in 2011. We had the Durban Climate Change Conference, the United Nations Conference on Sustainable Development in 2012, and a lot of other conferences. Then in 2015, we had the Paris Agreement during the COP21. So the Paris Agreement had a long-term goal where which was to keep the Earth's mean global temperature, to well below 2 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial levels, and to preferably limit that increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade, recognizing that anything above this would have a significant impact on the livability on the earth. And this is basically to limit the effects of climate change. And emissions should be reduced as soon as possible, and we should reach net zero by the middle of the 21st century. So the countries were supposed to be net zero by 2030. Since then, we have of course revised our net zero goals to future years 2050, 2070, etc. And then in 2016, we had the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which was the global goals, which are interlinked together, which have sustainability in their as their central principle. And 2016 also had the Kigali Amendment, which was the amendment to the Montreal Protocol for phasing out chlorofluorocarbons. And this is an international agreement to gradually reduce consumption and production of hydrofluorocarbons. And this is a legally binding agreement. And then we had COP24, COP25, COP26 was postponed because of COVID. And then we had this landmark report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2021, which reported that the extreme events, that is heat waves, cold waves, they are happening, droughts, famines, all of these extreme events are happening at an unprecedented rate, that they're increasing in the number of times they occur in a decade, as well as in the frequency in which they are happening across the globe because of climate change. And this is also triggered by the increase in temperature because of global warming. And in 2021, we also had the COP26 in Glasgow, which kept the goal of 1.5 degrees still intact, which is that the country should aim to um, reduce their emissions in order that the Earth's global mean temperature is does not increase beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade. So this was the timeline from the lectures. It took a long time to cover these timelines. So I will just go very fast to the other weeks. So in lecture 13, we looked up at the AIA law, policy, and institutional arrangement. And we talked about trends in the development of EIA system, where we identified wide and new areas. There are multiple level of decisions, local, international. There are systematic procedures and control, compliance, enforcement things. We also have an integrated consideration across the different sectors, temporal and spatial frameworks, environmental assessments, sustainability perspectives and principles, larger linkages, and that EIA is institutionalized. We also looked at the foundations of an effective EIA system, where you have clear basis in law regulation, clear statement of objectives and requirements, mandatory compliance and enforcements, comprehensive scoping of the applications and proposals for their potential impacts, prescribed processes and steps and activities. Then we also had provision for public consultation and access to public information, and linkages to project authorization, permitting, and condition setting. We also looked up at the framework from a legal perspective, that is the broad definition of environment and effects, the duty to avoid, mitigate, remedy adverse effects arising from the activity or proposal. We also looked up at the requirement for an EIA report to specify mitigation measures, the procedural guidance on compliance and good practices in applying EIA arrangements, and giving reasons for decision on proposal subject to EIA, all from a legal perspective. We also had a key elements of enabling environment for EIA and sustainability, where you have a legal regime, sound administration, and flexible policy making, stakeholder understanding. You have a uh, political commitment towards it, institutional capacity for implementing EIA and its measures, and adequate technology capacity, data information. You have public involvement and participation, and the financial capacity to do the EIA. And we also looked up at the conceptual understanding of law and policy. So we looked up at whether EIA takes place within the legal or policy framework established by the individual countries and international agencies. And law is a formal document administered by judiciary. Policy is a reference for working of the government and administered by the government. And laws are established in order to bring justice to society and equality, whereas policy is made to achieve specific goals by the government. So laws are mandatory and enforced by lawmakers, and policy is voluntary and undertaken on a specific personal basis case. Non-adherence to law is punishable, whereas non-adherence to policy does not lead to severe punishment. And we looked up at type and example of legal provisions. These are just examples. And then in lecture 14, we looked up at law, policy, and institutional arrangements for AIA systems, specifically from a perspective. So we looked up at key definitions of policy. The policy is a statement of intent to change behavior in a positive way. Policy instruments are means or measures to translate that intention into action. Governance is when societies or organizations make important decisions and determine who they involve and how they render responsibilities or account for these things. Cluster of policy are a collection of these policy instruments designed to achieve a common goal or set of intentions. So these are basic definitions of policies. Then we looked up at two type of policy instruments, primary and secondary, wherein primary include environmental policy goals and secondary include non-environmental goals. We had various mechanisms for policy instruments and different types of policy instruments, from legislation, regulation policy, market-based instruments, financial, voluntary, treaty agreements, international soft laws, voluntary agreements, research and development information instruments. And then we looked up at forms of government approaches and policy instruments relating to air. So we had governance approaches to mitigate air pollution and other problems. So these are technology, emission standards, planning regimes, market inventions, public information, and cooperation forums. And then we had a few global environmental agreements relevant to climate change, ozone depletion, and PBT, which is persistent bioaccumulative toxic chemicals. So these are international agreements around these three domains. And then in lecture 15, we looked up at, again, the law, policy, and institutional arrangements for the EIS systems from an air perspective. And we looked up at ambient air quality guidelines and standards for human health. We looked up at advisory and mandatory air quality standards and their expression in terms of mass of substance, that is milligram per unit of volume, milligram per meter cube, all volume of substance to the volume of air, parts per million, parts per billion. We look up at key international guidelines for different pollutants, the WHO, US, India, Europe, and their recommended base levels not to be breached for particular pollutants. Same thing for different other pollutants, carbon monoxide, ozone, and other things. Then we look up at critical key pollutants in UK. So they have different key pollutants and their critical levels for different measuring times and in different measuring places. And this is for India from for ecologically sensitive areas. This is notified by the central government. And then we have odor guidelines, which are adopted by different countries for measurement of odor. And FIDOL, which is the description of factors, which is frequency, intensity, duration, odor unpleasantness, and the location of the odor. So these are the odor factors. And then we looked up at some emission limits and standards, and from the globe and the Indian perspective. The slides will be available to you in the NPTEL course problem solving session on the left-hand side. And then we also had the key international guidelines for hazardous chemicals, which is the Service-Co 3 directive. And now let us do some Q&A based on the contents we have covered so far. So I would request you to please post your answers in the chat box, because we have quite a few participants at this moment, and I will look at the chat box. So the first question is, Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit in 1992 is an example of a non-binding instrument or a binding instrument. You can post your answers in the chat box. Okay, we have an answer, non-binding instrument. Yes, that is correct. And then moving on to, yes, non-binding is correct. You can just post A or B, that's okay. Moving on to question 2, the statement environmental impact assessment as a national instrument shall be undertaken for proposed activities that are likely to have a significant adverse impact on the environment and are subject to a decision of a competent national authority. This is covered under which principle of UNFCCC? So there are a few principles mentioned in the United Nations framework for climate conservation, for climate change. And okay, we have an answer option D, which is principle 20. So the correct answer is A, principle 17. So I put each of the principles definition here. Yes, A is correct. So Principle 17 talks about AIA and its definition. Principle 18 talks about in case of national disasters or other emergencies, the state has to inform the state has to notify other states surrounding it in things in case of natural disasters occurring, and the international community. Principle 19 talks about transboundary environmental effects and their notification, and principle 20 talks about women's role in sustainable development. Okay, question 3, relatively easy. Chernobyl accident is related with A, earthquake, B, tsunami, C, toxic radioactive explosion, and D, fire. Okay, this is an easy question. C, toxic radioactive explosion is correct. Moving on, under which reference the term cap and trade is used? A, emission trading, B, forex trading, D, C, energy trading, or D, all of the above. We discussed cap and trade in the I keep getting confused between. Okay. We have a few answers coming in. So cap and trade is basically for the emission trading. And so basically what happens is that uh, you have two different emitters. So this also basically works between countries as well. So you have one emitter, and this is the emission cap set by the respective regulating authority. And if you produce excess emissions above this benchmark, then you can sell these excess emissions to this emitter because it has this much cap for it to fill. So it takes these emissions. Both of these emitters are now at the baseline. So this process is known as cap and trade, wherein you trade the excess emissions which you produce to a less emission producing emitter for the monetary value. So this process is known as emission trading, and uh, cap and trade is the term for this type of emission trading. Okay, so cap and trade is used for emission trading. And now match group 1 with group 2 with the correct option. So on group 1, we have the environmental protocol or agreement or framework, and group 2 identifies the different provision it makes. So we have to match the protocol with what is the provisions that they are taking. Okay, we have an option C. Okay, so the correct option was B. So the Montreal Protocol talked about phasing out substances that deplete the ozone layer, that is chlorofluorocarbons or ozone depleting substances, ODS. The Paris Agreement talked about limiting global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably to below 1.5 degrees. That talked about reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. And Kyoto Protocol talked about emission trading. So just an option, just a quick reference, like a pro tip, if you try to match, if you have like certain abbreviations for the protocol or event, you can just try to see if it matches any of the initials from from the other options. For example, you can directly match that with reducing emissions for deforestation and forest degradation. So this is just a tip for if you are lost at options. So B is the correct answer. Now, moving on, question 6. Kyoto Protocol is related to A, ozone depletion, B, hazardous waste, C, climate change, and D, nuclear energy. Okay. C, climate change is correct. So moving on, question 7. With respect to emission reduction goal, what does NDC stand for? Okay, B. So NDC basically stands for Nationally Determined Contributions. So these are basically the contributions which specific countries are specifying in with reference to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So A is the correct answer. So for example, this is a excerpt from a report. So the UK, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and North Ireland at that point, the UK, communicated its nationally determined contribution, NDC, to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, in line with Article 4 of Paris Agreement. And in its NDC, UK commits to reducing economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions by at least 68% by 2030 compared to the 1990 or pre-industrial levels. So NDC is basically the contributions which a country is aiming to achieve in the Paris Agreement, in line with the Paris Agreement. Okay, moving on to question 8. Which of the following will qualify for green list? So we have a few conventions. So the green list basically deals with biodiversity and wildlife. So which of the following conventions? Okay, A is correct. Okay, so you can try to look up at the options and look up at a possible hint from the question itself for your examination answering. Moving on, question 9. Which of the following powers are conferred to Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change by Environmental Protection Act of 1986? 1. Environmental clearance, 2. Eco-sensitive zone, 3. Coastal regulation zone, and 4. Infrastructure development. So you need to see which of these options are correct for in order to answer in terms of ABCD. So we have an option D, which is not correct. So the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change confers the powers of environmental clearance. Like the ministry has the power for environmental clearance, for declaring eco-sensitive zone, and for coastal regulation zones. It does not talk about infrastructure development. So the option B is correct. Moving on to question 10. Match the following with examples. So in group 1, we have legal provisions, and in group 2, we have examples. So you need to match group 1 with group 2. This is also one of the questions in the assignment, so you would have answered this at some point. Okay. So the General Environmental Law is the NEPA, which is the Environmental Protection Act, NEPA in the US, the Environmental Protection Act 1986 in India. So they are general environmental laws. Whereas a comprehensive resource management and planning law is like the New Zealand RMA. So Q matches with 2, P matches with 4, and enabling or framework EIA law is a European directive, so it matches with 2. And S, which is comprehensive or prescriptive EIA law, Yes, C is correct. Matches with the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, CAEE. This was covered in lecture 13 or 14, and I put it in my highlights for the week's slides, so you can look at them after the session. So option C is correct. Moving on to question 11. State true or false. Primary environmental policies are the ones whose primary goals are concerned with environment, while secondary policies are the ones whose primary goals are non-environmental. Is the statement true or false? Okay, and we covered this in our notes as well, in our highlight section as well. So it is true. Yes, that is correct. Moving on to question 12, we need to match the terms with their meanings. So we also covered this in lecture 15, where we look up at different terms and their meanings. So we have a cluster of policies. Okay, we have one option. Okay, so the correct option is D. So for example, P, which is cluster of policy, matches with 2, which is collection of policy instruments, all designed to achieve a common goal or set of intentions. Command and control are um, include technology, emissions, or ecosystem restoration standards. Record keeping and reporting requirements are control, or limit or manufacture trade or use of specific chemicals or products, each of which are implemented through permitting and enforcement law. So all of these things are either commanding and controlling. Then our planning regime talks about strategies or action plans designed to achieve ambient air quality standards or objectives or attain emission ceilings combined with analysis and environmental impact assessments. So R matches with 4, and then S matches with 1, which talks about including economical instruments such as taxes, fees, or markets for tradable emission rights, as well as loans and subsidies. So the correct option is D, that is P matches with 2, Q matches with 3, R matches with 4, and S matches with 1. Okay. So moving on, we have question 13, which is state true or false. Montreal Protocol addressed stratospheric ozone depletion and became the first United Nations convention to be ratified by all United Nations member states. Is this statement true or false? Yes, the statement is true. Moving on, so question 14, we have select the mandatory law or policy guidelines on air quality for the country in the following options. So you need to select the mandatory law or policy guidelines on air quality. So we looked up at them briefly in our highlights as well. So we have National Ambient Air Quality Standard as Air Prevention and Control of Pollution Act 1981. We have the WHO guideline values. We have the Environment, Health and Safety EHS guidelines, and we have the Good International Industry Practice, GIIP. Okay, we have one answer A, that is correct. So the others are voluntary policy guidelines, but the first one is a mandatory law for India. Okay, moving on to question 15. What is the full form of ppm with respect to air quality? Fairly simple. Is it A, parts per million, B, production per million, C, pollution per million, or D, particulate matter per million? A, parts per million is correct. So moving on to question 16, state true or false. CPCB provides air quality standards for ecologically sensitive areas also. Is this statement true or false? So the CPCB is the Central Pollution Control Board. Okay. Okay, A is correct. Okay, moving on to the parameters related with odor are abbreviated as. So we discussed them in our highlights as well. So there are 5 parameters. What are they abbreviated as? Okay, so the 5 parameters are abbreviated as FIDOL in terms of their order. So it's frequency, intensity, duration, odor unpleasantness, and location. So C is the correct answer. These are basically the first initial letters of these factors. So FIDOL is the correct answer. Now moving on to 18. Okay, CPCB stands for A, Central Processing Control Band, B, Central Pollution and Coastal Branch, C, Center of Pollution and Control Board, and D, Central Pollution Control Board. Okay, I just gave a hint in the previous question where I told the full form for CPCB. So the CPCB is ESD, Central Pollution Control Board. C is slightly confusing as well, but it's Central Pollution Control Board. That is correct. Okay, moving on to question 19. What does UNEP in context of EIA stands for? Is it United National Environmental Program, United Nations Ecological Program, United Nations Environment Program, or United Nations Ecology Program? Okay, yes, the correct answer is C, United Nations Environmental Program. United Nations Environment Program, yes, C is correct. Okay, so moving on to week 3 assignment, because the deadline for week 3 has passed. We're going to discuss the solutions to week 3 assignment. Okay. So, okay. So you need to match the following global environmental timeline. So you have in group 1, you have the years, and in group 2, you have the event happening. So I would just like to highlight again that the years and events are important in both the lecture 13 and lecture 14. Wait, sorry. In lecture 11 and lecture 12. Yes, in lecture 11 and in lecture 12, which talks about the global environmental timeline. Okay, so we have an option C. C is correct. So in 1973, we had the United Nations Conference on Law of Sea, New York. So Q matches with 1. In 1974, we have P. We had the United Nations Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, which is CITES. So P matches with 2. And then in 1978, we had the Amoco Cadiz oil spill on the coast of Brittany, France. And in 1976, we had the United Nations Conference on Human Settlements in Vancouver. So C is correct. Moving on. Match the following global environmental timeline. So group 1 again has years, and group 2 again has the event happening. So you need to match the years with the event. So we have an option. Okay, so C is the correct answer. In 1981, we had the Global Strategy for Health for All. By 2000. In 1984, we had the Bhopal gas tragedy. In 1979, we had the Convention on Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution was adopted. And in 1980, we had the World Conservation Strategy report published. So C is correct. Moving on to question 3, this is again match the following. You need to match group 1 with group 2. Now this is specifically from lecture 12, where we talk about the timeline from 2000 to 2021. Okay, so C is the correct answer. So in 2005, we had the Kyoto Protocol, so P matches with 2. In 2004, the first environmentalist to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize was Wangri Maathai, so Q matches with 1. In 2015, we had the Paris Agreement at COP21, so our matches with 4. Then 2007, we had the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Bali. So C is correct. Moving on to question 4, state true or false. So in 2003, United Nations General Assembly endorsed the United Nations Decade of Education for Sustainable Development. Is the statement true and false? Yes, we discussed this in our division of the lecture 12 as well. The statement is true, correct? And state true or false, in 2005, Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, MEA, was released. So this was the report where we looked up at the relationship between ecosystem services and the human well-being. Okay, yes, this is true. Moving on to question 6, we have matched the stages in the AIA notification 2006 prior to environmental clearance process for new projects. So you have the different stages in the AIA, and you have the different uh, actions that happen in each of these stages in group 2. So you need to match group 1 with group 2. Okay, so we have an option C, which is correct. So stage 1 is screening, where we look up at the project's description and look up at the categories specified and see if EIA is even needed for the projects, and only group B projects are uh, further put forward for EIA. Then in stage 2, we describe the scoping of impacts, and in stage 3, we do public consultations based on our efforts and mitigations with the public involvement, and in stage 4, we do the appraisal of the EIA application. So P matches with 2, Q matches with 1, R matches with 4, and S matches with 3. So C is the correct answer. Moving on, question 7, the foundation for the effective EIA system are 1, clear basis in law and regulation, 2, clear basis of objectives and statement, 3, mandatory compliance and enforcement, and 4, comprehensive scope of application to proposals with potentially significant impact. So which of these statements describe the foundation for an effective system? Okay, so we discussed this in lecture 13, where we talk about AIA systems. And all of these statements form the foundation for effective EIA systems. So D, all of these are correct. Moving on to question 8, match the following with examples. So we again have legal provisions and group 2 examples. We discussed this in the extra additional questions as well. So the correct answer was C. We have discussed this in the previous question as well. Okay, moving on to question 9, national ambient air quality standards or guidelines for number of common pollutants differ with respect to 1, pollution target, 2, concentration level, 3, averaging time, and 4, measurement protocols. So we're talking about national ambient air quality standards or guidelines. And what does the number of common pollutants differ with respect to? Okay, we have an answer D. D is correct. All of these factors cause a difference in the number of pollutants. So D is correct. Moving on to question 10, you need to match the following definitions in group 1 with their description in group 2. So in group 1, we have governance, policy, and policy instruments, and we did discuss these in our highlights section as well. Okay, C is correct. So governance is the process where societies or organizations make important decisions. That is, they determine who they want to involve and how they are going to render responsibility and roles. So P matches with 3. Q, policy, talks about the statement of intent to change the behavior in a positive way. So Q matches with 1. And policy instruments are the means or a specific measure to translate the intention of the policy into the specific action. So R matches with 2. So C is the correct answer. Moving on to question 11, that is the type of policy instrument. Uh, which of the following are the types of policy instruments? So one, we have regulations and regulatory policy standard. Two, we have market-based instruments. Three is research and development. Four is treaties and agreements. So which of the followings are the types of policy instruments? We discussed them in our highlights as well. Okay, so D is the correct answer. All of these are the types of policy instruments. Okay, moving on to question 12, which is objectives of NAMP, which is the National Air Quality Monitoring Program India. Which of the following are the objectives of NAMP? One, to determine status and trends of ambient air quality. Two, to ascertain whether the prescribed ambient air quality standards are violated. Three, to identify non-attainment cities. And four, to obtain the knowledge and understanding necessary for developing preventive and corrective measures. Okay, D is the correct answers. All of these are the objectives of the National Air Quality Monitoring Program for India. Okay, moving on to question 13. We need to match the odor recognized as a nuisance in the industries under Section 1 Environment Protection Rules 1986. So in Group 1, we have the odor. And in Group 2, we have the odor category or the nuisance category. So we have an option C. C is correct. So basically, fermentation industries like distillers, malteries, and breweries have to take all efforts to make to be made so that odor is removed from the environment. Natural rubber industries, the odor should be absent. For large pulp and paper mill, you use hydrogen sulfide odorous. Uh, 10 milligram per cubic meter, and for coffee processing, you have no compliance norms. However, public complaints are received. So C is the correct answer. That is P matches with 2, Q matches with 1, R matches with 4, and S matches with 3. Okay, moving on to, okay. So I think I'm going to skip the additional content for this session because we have uh, reached our time limit. So we didn't have any queries for this section. I would like to ask people to please post their queries in the discussion forums as and when you go through the course content so that we can cover your queries in the session. And thank you so much for joining this session. If you have any queries, you can ask now or you can post it in the discussion forum. I will put this put these slides in the problem solving session. You can access them from the folders. So you have a problem solving tab in the NPTEL left hand side where you select the weeks. So you can click on there and you can access these videos as well as the materials which we use for presenting. Okay. We have a question. Is there any ISO for industrial air pollution? I'm not sure about it. I will have a look and I will put it in the discussion forum. Prafula, if you want to unmute yourself and ask directly, you can ask directly as well instead of typing if you want to. Okay.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah, actually, I'm working in industrial field, in water and
Okay.
wastewater management, and we are
Okay.
wastewater industry. And during that time, we have found
Y-
that there's such a poor air quality is there because of some ash content and the emission gases come from their chimneys. Okay, for
Yes.
this,
Yes.
there are a lot of audits are going on. But if there are any
Okay.
specific IS certification for that, so I want to be do that certification
Okay.
for joining event.
Okay. So okay. So I am not aware about an ISO certification as of yet, but I will have a look at it and I will put it in the discussion forum. Uh, I will also discuss it with Lakra ma'am because I am not aware of an ISO certification as of this moment.
Okay.
But I will definitely look at it and put it in the discussion forums.
Thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Okay. Do we have any other question? Okay. Thank you so much for joining this problem solving session. And if once again, if you have any questions, you can put them in the discussion forums. Me and the other PMRFTA, we go through these discussion forums and try to answer your questions in these problem solving sessions. The video for this session will be uploaded on YouTube, and the course material would be put on a Google Drive. Both of these will be put in the Google Sheet. So the link for the YouTube video will also be put in the Google Sheet, and the link for the Google Drive will also be put in the Google Sheet, which you can find in the problem solving tab in the left hand side of your course. So yeah, thank you so much for joining.